What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to another Apex Legends tip video. With this one, this is for all of the console players out there. I'm going to be going through all of the settings for console in order to help you guys find the perfect settings for you. Keep in mind, a lot of the stuff in this video is going to come down to personal preference, but I'm going to explain exactly what each of the things do, especially the response curves. That's something I get asked about a ton. So I'm going to go through all that stuff. I'm also going to share my settings, so for those of you guys that are curious about my settings, you'll be able to see those. So without further ado, let's hop into the settings. So within the first settings tab, we have the gameplay settings, and with this one, the only thing that I've really changed here is the damage numbers. I personally like using both. I've explained this before in a previous video. This is the numbers that pop up above your target after you shoot them. If you have stacking, it adds up all of your shots within a certain period of time, and it will just display that total number. If you have floating, it displays an individual damage number for every shot that hits, and therefore you're kind of left doing your own math if you want to see the total amount of damage that you've dealt. Personally, I like using both so I can see the floating, so I see how many hits I have hit, but I also see that total number so I know how much damage I've dealt to my enemy. Everything else in this area I just keep as default. I feel like the default settings are just fine for me and the way I play. Next up, we have the controller settings tab, and this is where we're really going to be focusing most of this video. Now, the first thing we have here is our button layout, and this is extremely important, and I would highly encourage you guys, if you haven't already, to switch to button puncher. Now, with button puncher, the only difference compared to the default layout is it swaps your melee with your crouch. So for those Call of Duty players out there, this is the tactical button layout. Now for Apex Legends especially, I feel this is an extremely important button layout to have, simply because sliding is one of the most important things that you can be doing in this game when it comes to movement. And therefore, I feel it's best to have it right there at your fingertips, or I guess thumb tip in this instance, so you don't have to remove your thumb from the right analog stick in order to hit circle in order to slide. You've got it right there all the time so you can maintain your aim while sliding. I feel like it's much more important to do that than it is to have melee attached to that button. Yes, this will come at the cost of having less accurate melee attacks, but if you think about how much you're sliding versus how often you're meleeing enemies, the choice is pretty clear to me, at least within Apex Legends. So I would highly encourage you to try out the button puncher layout if you haven't already. Now, as we scroll down through the list of settings, the next one that I change is sensitivity. And sensitivity is a very personal sort of a setting. It's different for everybody, so don't necessarily just copy what I use just because I use it. You have to play around with this a little bit for yourself to find the right sensitivity for you. Same thing goes with the response curve. So for me, what I personally have found works the best is a 4 sensitivity with a 3 aim down sight sensitivity. So what that means is I'm able to spin around faster when I'm hip firing rather than aiming down sight, which I feel really helps with my precision while aiming down sights, but also my ability to turn on enemies if they end up getting behind me in close quarter situations. As for the response curve, I use classic, and this is where we're going to start getting into this. The response curve is basically how your aim will react depending on how you're moving your analog stick or your aiming stick. So with some response curves, if you move your analog stick just a little bit, it will barely move your aim, whereas with another response curve, you can move that analog stick just a little bit and it will move your aim really, really quickly. When it comes to the first two response curves, classic as well as steady, these are actually very, very similar. It's hard to really tell too much of a difference between these two. And with both of these, it's quite balanced. If you move the analog stick just a little bit, your aim will move just a little bit. If, however, you move your analog stick a lot, you will get a decent amount of acceleration with your aim, and therefore you can spin around quite quickly, and I feel you have a lot of control over that. When it comes to the fine aim response curve, which is actually quite a popular choice as well, I personally don't like it, but I know a lot of people do. With this one, if you're moving your analog stick just a little bit, you have very, very fine control over your aim, which is excellent for those long-range shots. But it has a very steep acceleration curve, which means once you reach that threshold where you move your analog stick just a little bit more, you will suddenly have a very quick ramp up, and therefore your aim will start spinning very, very fast after that. So it's not quite as smooth of a ramp up in acceleration as the classic or the steady curve. This brings us to high velocity, which personally, I don't know of anybody that uses the high velocity response curve, and I don't think I could ever recommend it. With this one, it's kind of the reverse of the fine aim. If you just barely touch that analog stick while using high velocity, it pretty much immediately kicks into your maximum acceleration. And with this, you have no real fine control over your aim, and therefore hitting your shots at longer distances will be extremely difficult, nearly impossible. So like I said, I just can't recommend using the high velocity response curve. This just leaves us with one last response curve, which is linear, and this is raw input. So with this one, there is actually no acceleration of your aim, and therefore, as you're moving your analog stick, it doesn't really ramp up at all. And some people do like this feel, so I'm not going to say that this is a horrible feel, but personally, like I said, I would stick to classic, steady, or fine aim if that appeals to you. This is where you definitely have to just hop into the training mode, get yourself to the gun stage, and then start messing around with your sensitivities as well as your response curve to find what's best for you. You should be able to snap between those targets within the training range fairly quickly while also being accurate. Now, the next important setting here is our dead zone. We have the look dead zone as well as the movement dead zone, and for those of you guys that don't know what a dead zone is, essentially, if you have no dead zone, any movement whatsoever to your analog stick will cause your aim to move. And for a lot of people, especially with older controllers, this can even happen without you touching the analog stick. They just end up loosening up a little bit, and therefore your aim will automatically drift, and you don't really want that. You don't want the controller automatically drifting you off target, and therefore this is where dead zones come in. At the same time, you don't want too large of a dead zone because that means then when you're trying to make fine adjustments to your aim, it may not detect that input because of the dead zone, because you're moving within the dead zone. So the goal is to have the lowest dead zone possible without getting any drift while you set the controller down. This is actually extremely easy to set up, so once again, hop into that training mode, get your sensitivity and response curve set up the way you want it, set your look dead zone to none, and then set your controller down. If that center dot moves at all, this means you have to up your dead zone. Once you get to the point where it doesn't move at all, you're set. Just leave it the way it is, and you're good to go. Same thing goes with the movement dead zone, although this is with your other analog stick, and this has to do with whether or not you will end up walking on your own without touching your controller. If you set your controller down and you see that your character is creeping forward or backwards a little bit, then you will have to increase the movement dead zone. But for most people that have a controller that's in decent shape, the small movement dead zone should be just fine for you. Now, the last setting here that I personally change is I turn vibration off. I don't like having that extra distraction. I see it as a distraction having my controller vibrating all the time, and therefore I leave it off, but a lot of people really like that extra little bit of feedback. So that's the controller settings that I use, and that's the main portion of this video, but there is one last setting I want to have a look at, and this is field of view. This is within the video tab, and with this one, it is extremely important to find the right field of view for you. Now, field of view in this game ranges from 70, which is quite narrow, so you can really focus on what's in front of you, all the way up to 110, which is a very wide field of view, so you can see what's going on right next to you, but it can be a bit more difficult to focus on what's in front of you. Now, there are pros and cons with having a low field of view and a high field of view. When you have a very narrow field of view, this obviously limits what you can see going on around you, and therefore it can limit your awareness a little bit. So if somebody's standing right next to you, if you're on a 70 field of view, you might not be able to see him, whereas on a 110 field of view, he would be very clearly visible for you. On the other end of that, though, if you have an extremely high field of view, I've really noticed this a lot personally. My accuracy at mid to long range goes out the window when I have a super high field of view. I find it makes it more difficult for me to focus on the finer details while aiming down sight and seeing my enemy, and therefore I find myself missing shots more often if my field of view value is too high. In addition to that, with a high field of view, you may run into performance issues because there's more going on your screen at once. This means you can either lose frames, or I believe they have a resolution downscaling system, so they'll actually downscale your resolution in real time when there's a lot of action going on in order to maintain a higher frame rate. This is obviously not something you want to be happening, especially in the middle of a gunfight where there's a lot going on. You don't want to be losing frames, and you don't want your resolution to be doing weird things. So especially if you're using a standard PS4 or a standard Xbox, you probably don't want to be using the highest field of view settings because you will likely run into more performance issues. With my PS4 Pro, I've even noticed a few performance issues when my field of view is too high. I noticed that I have dropped a few frames, and therefore, for me personally, I know this is a lot lower than a lot of people would recommend. My current favorite field of view ranges somewhere between 80 and 90. I'm still kind of on the fence. Sometimes I'm bumping down to 80, sometimes I'm back up to 90. But overall, my performance, I feel, is better when I play within that range. Now, there's going to be a ton of people out there saying that that is far too low, and if you're not using at least 100, then you're a scrub and you just suck at the game. But I've noticed a huge difference in my performance in-game by having that slightly lower field of view. So this is something you have to play around with and find what works for you. But with that pretty much covers all of the settings I use to find the most success possible within Apex Legends while using a controller. I'm actually really curious to see in the comment section below, what response curve have you found to be the best for you? I'm really interested to see what the results are on this because I have a feeling that most people will stick to classic or steady, but I want to see if there are any high velocity users out there or people that are maybe using fine or linear. Also, just out of curiosity, if you're on console, what field of view have you found is best? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.
Yeah.